Bit of scene setting first of all. This is an aircraft carrier. The things you see on the telly these days with the bendy up bits at the front and the two towers and whatever, that's not an aircraft carrier. That's an aircraft carrier. It's got two nice big steam catapults at the front. It's got a string of arrestor wires at the back when they fill the hole in at the back of the lift. And it's got a nice big angled flight deck in the middle. That's a proper aircraft carrier, okay? That's HMS Victorious. The timescale probably around late 50s, early 1960s, something like that, just to give you an idea. Now, de Havilland had quite a bit of form with naval aviation in that sort of era. The very first jet aircraft ever to land on an aircraft carrier in the world was a de Havilland aircraft. It was that one there, de Havilland Vampire. The time was December 1946. The ship was HMS Ocean, and the pilot on board was Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown, Winkle Brown, if any of you have ever heard of him. It was the first time a pure jet aircraft had ever landed on. The Navy didn't take the Vampire to sea for a couple of reasons. First off was that the throttle response on the very early de Havilland Goblin engines, jet engines, wasn't terribly good. You'd demand the throttle, you'd make a throttle change, and the engine would take a few seconds to respond, which is okay if you're landing on land, but if you're landing on an aircraft carrier, as you come in on the approach, it's a matter of constant speed adjustments, constant throttle adjustments. You really do want something that's going to respond instantly to your demands. And Eric Brown felt that while he could do it, it wasn't suitable for what would probably be the average Fleet Air Arm pilot to be able to safely land on the carrier. Second reason is that the Vampire, particular early jet engines generally, were quite short on fuel, which again is less of a problem on land because you take off from an airfield, you go off and you do whatever you need to do. The airfield is still where you left it when you came back in. Not so with a ship. It's gone, it's moved. And so you have to have a bit of fuel in reserve to be able to find the thing afterwards, just in case you have to do a bit of a navigational exercise in bad weather to find your landing ground. So for those two reasons, the Navy never took the Vampire to sea. They did use it, they used it on land. It was an excellent aircraft for familiarization of pilots with basic first generation jet aircraft. Along after the Vampire came the Sea Venom, which was a development of the RAF's land-based Venom. We'll take a look at that a little bit in a minute. Now, I need to clear up a misconception first. Anybody here works for MBDA? I suspect quite a few of you. Hands up if you work for MBDA. Right, okay. This is not a Sea Venom, all right? I don't care what people say, it's not a Sea Venom. It's a rocket, all right? Don't go calling it a Sea Venom. This is a Sea Venom. Actually, it's 5 Sea Venoms, all right? So that's what it is. What is a Sea Venom? Well, it's a development of the Royal Air Force Venom FB3, which was a night fighter. The Venom itself was a development of the Vampire. It was a single seat, 4 cannons underneath the floor, single seat, single engine, basic jet fighter. Did very well as a successor to the Vampire with the Royal Air Force. The RAF went to de Havilland and said, we would like a development of that as a night fighter with a radar in the nose and the second crew member sitting by the pilot to operate the radar. The other difference of the Venom is that it had the bigger engine. It had the de Havilland Ghost engine, which was a bigger and more powerful version of the Goblin. It lacked that problem with the throttle response lag that we had with the Vampire engine with the Goblin, so it was a suitable seaworthy engine. And the Navy, seeing this, realised it would be a suitable type of aircraft to land on the carrier, requested de Havilland to produce a naval version of the aircraft. And so was born the Sea Venom. Now, to navalise an aeroplane, you make a few changes from it. You can't just take a land-based aircraft straight to sea. Most obvious change, of course, is the folding wings, because there's very little room on a carrier deck. So you have to fold the thing up nice and tight to get it on. So there we see the folding wings. You've got an arrestor hook at the back, so that when you come into land, you can catch the wire, the arresting wire that's stretched across the carrier deck. There's not just the one, there's about 3 or 4, so that you've got a fighting chance of catching one of them as you come into land. You've got 2 hooks under the front wings, just under the air intakes there, which are where you attach the catapult strop on to loop yourself around the hook on the steam catapult, which will then throw you off the deck at an acceleration of something like, I don't know what it is for Sea Venom, but for the Civics and the later one, it was 0 to 150 30 miles an hour in 0.6 seconds, I think, something like that. It's ridiculous. And so that's an important thing. So the whole thing has to be stressed for being basically pulled in half on catapult launch and arrested recovery. You don't take off and land, but see, you launch and recover as well. Important difference. What else have we got? You need a stronger undercarriage. You need a nice big meaty undercarriage because you're now landing on a surface that might be coming up to meet you. And so you need a very, very resilient, robust undercarriage. And the last thing you need is you need good corrosion protection on your aeroplane on the metal parts because the thing is exposed to salty air all the time and it's going to rot away if you don't look after it. So a naval aeroplane is quite a different beast to a land-based aircraft. So that basically is a Sea Venom. It's a second generation jet. It's a twin seat, side by side, pilot one side, navigator on the other side, except we don't call them navigators in the Navy, they're observers for traditional reasons. Can't see anything, but he's called an observer. So there you are. And you have a nice big radar in the nose. You have four 20mm cannon underneath the fuselage, and you can carry rockets and bombs as well. That's the basic. The one I'm working on is the one at the de Havilland Aircraft Museum, which is not that far down the road from here at London Colney. If you've ever been to there, I do recommend a visit. Ours, obviously every aircraft is different. Ours is X-Ray Golf 730. And I'll just give you a very potted history of it and how we got involved with it. First flew in 1957. It was the 7th from last Sea Venom ever to be built. It was really at the very, very back end of the production line. They first flew in about 52. They made a good few hundred of them. They were very successful. They were exported to Australia, exported to France, built under license actually in France. And our particular aeroplane, 730, first flew 1957 on 1st of August. It earned its corn really in operational service on board the Bulwark, HMS Bulwark and HMS Centaur. It served all over the globe with those two carriers in home waters. It flew in the Far East. We believe it may have fired its guns in anger in the Aden crisis, now Yemen. In those days it was Aden. On its way home from a detachment when Centaur was on its way home from Singapore. We believe it actually had a very brief actual hot war operational career. It came out of service when the Sea Venom was declared obsolete and replaced by the Sea Vixen, and the squadron it was with disbanded, and it came out of service in 1960. It was stored, because it was still airworthy, it was stored at an airbase called HMS Sandling, which is at Royal Naval Air Station Abbots Inch, up in Glasgow. While it was there, an important event happened, because in 1961 it came very close to me. Wee baby boy, basically across the fence from the airbase. It's where my mum grew up. It's where my parents were married. It's where a lot of my family came from and still live. So I have a lot of connections with that area. It was moved out of Abbots Inch when it closed. The Naval Air Base closed in the 60s, became the new Glasgow Airport. If you fly up to Glasgow Airport, that is what it is today. And so they had to store it elsewhere. It went to Belfast, where it stayed until 1970, and it came back into service then as a second line aircraft at RNS Yeovilton, HMS Heron, down in Somerset. And it was used there for radar calibration, general sort of transportation, hack if you need to go somewhere or something like that. And it flew quite happily there for 5 years until the 7th of July 1970, and then it came out of service. What the Navy did with it then is they made it a gate guardian over HMS Dryad, Portsmouth Navy base. It's up on the hill over the city of Portsmouth. They basically stuck it on a roundabout outside the base, which is a rather cruel thing to do to any aeroplane, particularly cruel to a thing like a Sea Venom, because the front end of a Sea Venom is made out of wood. It's made out of the same plywood and balsa wood composite sandwich structure as a Mosquito was during the war, because the Sea Venom was developed from the Vampire, which was developed at the same time as the Mosquito was being built during the war. So the last thing you really want to do is leave the thing outside, especially in Portsmouth where you've still got the sea air and everything else. So it didn't really do very well when it was there, but it stayed there for 8 years. When eventually I think the Navy got tired of it, and I don't know the story, but I presume the deal with what was then the Mosquito Museum, now the de Havilland Museum, I presume the deal was something like, if you guys come and bring down a flatbed truck and take it to pieces, you can have it for free. We just want rid of it. And so there it is, being taken to pieces by museum staff, 1978. Came up the road to London Colney, just down the road from here. and it was displayed incorrectly in the markings of 894 Squadron. We'll get to that rather nerdy bit later on. But basically, it was outdoors for most of its time when it was stored until the mid sort of 2010s. Just a point of interest, the aircraft behind it is the museum's Comet airliner, and it's the last example of a Comet airliner with square windows, with the original square windows. I'm happy to say that fuselage looks in a much better condition now, and also it's indoors. It's in the museum's new hangar, as is the Sea Venom. So that was it until 2006. Then in 2006, it met me again. In the intervening 45 years, I put on an awful lot of body weight, gained and subsequently lost a great deal of hair, not gained a great deal of natural intelligence or common sense. But I came along in 2006 as a new volunteer to the de Havilland Aircraft Museum. I'd been going along as a visitor for quite a few years by that stage, and eventually decided to, sign up and take the Queen's shilling and actually become a volunteer. On my first day as a volunteer, the couple of the senior guys said to me, "Right, Alistair, welcome aboard. First two questions: first of all, are you an aircraft engineer?" And I said no. I'm actually a chemical engineer, but I said no, but I'm just always interested in aircraft. I said fair enough. Are you interested in aircraft generally, or do you have a specific interest? And I said no, I'm particularly interested in naval aircraft. They said, great, do you want to do the Sea Venom then? I said, what do you mean do the Sea Venom? And they said, well, there it is. It's over there. Nobody's looking after it. Everybody that comes in here wants to work on mosquitoes. And I said, well, I don't. I'm not interested in mosquitoes. I'll do the Sea Venom then. Thank you very much. And so off we went. And so that was how I came into contact with the Sea Venom. Why am I interested in naval aircraft? Well, I owe it to the gentleman on the left of this photograph here, who's my old dad. Sadly, no longer with us. He died a year before I volunteered at the museum. I wish I'd done it earlier because he would have loved all of this. He did his national service in the Royal Navy just after the Second World War. And he was an aircraft engine mechanic in the Fleet Air Arm based at Lyon Solent. And he subsequently became an engineer. He had quite a good national service. A job that he was quite enjoying. He didn't have to go very far away from home. He lived in Brighton. He could go home on the weekends. Didn't have to go to sea, and he got to play with aircraft engines, which he quite enjoyed. So, as a result of his enthusiasm, as dads do to kids, and as I know Tony's father did with him, and inspired him into the aerospace industry. So my dad got me into aircraft. He didn't work in the aerospace industry, actually, but he just got me interested in aeroplanes, and specifically naval aircraft. We went to air shows, we went to the Royal Tournament, we did all that sort of thing together. And so that's where I got the interest from. I had worked on restorations before. I'd restored my old MGB a few years previously, in the mid-90s. It was the first car I ever bought when I left college in 1983. I still have it to this day. It still runs. But it was a basket case by the mid-90s, and so I took it into the garage and I took it to pieces and restored it. Enjoyed the exercise, actually, quite enjoyed it. So a few years later, I was itching to get my hands dirty once again. Hence, I went along to the de Havilland Museum and got unexpectedly presented with the Sea Venom on day one. So far, so good, except that that's what they gave me. That's what it looked like on day one when I got to it. Yes, I'll do the Sea Venom, he said, and that's what it was. Like I said, it had been outdoors for a long time, and because the front end's made of wood, you can see what the wooden bit is. It's the central fuselage pod from behind the radar down to the engine firewall. The wings are metal, the tail's metal, which has been taken off there. It was a right old basket case, I can tell you. That's another photograph of it when it was in the hangar. It's one of the earliest photographs I took. It was a mess. The cockpit was a mess. This is standing up and looking down into it. Basically, the canopy leaked, the canopy frame leaked. Any water that went in there could only get one way out, and that was by rotting its way out through the floor. So the floor was full of holes. The radar is wrong. The radar is a Sea Vixen radar. It shouldn't be in there at all, and so on and so forth. So off I went, gung-ho, little man with big job to do, get the spanner out, get the screwdriver, started taking the thing to pieces. And in doing so, broke rule 1 of aircraft restoration, which is you do not take the thing to pieces before you've photographed every last goddamn inch of it, because you've no idea of what it's going to look like when it's all in pieces. You've no idea how everything is going to go back together again. Photograph it all. If I'd had my time again, I would have spent the first 3 weekends just going around the thing with a camera and photographing and making notes, making sketches and so on and so forth. But no, off I went, started taking bits off it. I learnt that lesson pretty quickly. So we go into the dismantling. First thing we did was take the engine out. The engine is not a subtle exercise to take an engine out of a Sea Vixen or probably any aeroplane. It's only held in by 4 bolts anyway, so you've only got to undo 4 bolts and get a whacking great high-ab crane on it and lift the thing out. And away you go. We don't want the engine at this stage. We're not interested, so we just get rid of it, poke it on the side of the hangar somewhere. The hole that you get left with is this. This is the firewall. This is me standing where the engine used to be, looking in. You've obviously got the 2 great big air intakes there, one either side, wing root air intakes. All of this on the sides is the hydraulics in the wing root for the flying controls and for the wing fold. All of the stuff on the back end of the firewall is the throttle controls, fuel cocks, so on and so forth. It's all got to come out. Take it all out, catalogue it, tag it, everything else. We'll talk about that in a minute. You see what I mean? You photograph it all before you start, otherwise you've no idea where you're going to end up. As we go on, we get more and more into the dismantling. You get to the point you've taken everything out the cockpit. You're left with a bare wooden shell for the cockpit. The wings have got to come off because I could just see in behind the wings that the wood in where the cockpit meets the wings was quite badly rotted. So that all had to come out. So the wings had to be unbolted, but the wings are only held on by 3 bolts each anyway, so that's quite all right. It doesn't take long. It's 10 bolts basically hold the whole thing together, 4 for the engine and 3 for each wing. So it's not really held on by very much at all. Which kind of leads us on to rule 2 of aircraft restoration, that you take it to pieces as if it's not going to be you putting it back together again. It probably will be you putting it back together again, but let's pretend it isn't. Let's pretend you've got to leave enough documentation and enough records for a complete stranger to go back and put it in. Because in 5, 6, 7, 10 years' time, when the reassembly starts, you will be that complete stranger. As much as you think you're going to remember how it all went, how it all came apart, you ain't, because you've had 10 years of life in between, and you won't remember a thing. So leave yourself a trail, leave yourself an audit trail, photos, drawing, records. It all goes up on a shelf. Here we are. Here's one of the shelves. I cornered the market in these little white dangly luggage tags. Every single component has a little tag on it saying where it came out from the aircraft, what system is it from, fuel, oil, oxygen, hydraulics, whatever it came from, what shelf it's on, and a database on the PC of where everything went, where it came from, and where to find it again when we need it. And I'm happy to say that it did actually work. Into the cockpit, seen this before, basically it was a right old mess, so it all had to come out. And once everything was stripped out, seats come out fairly easy. Obviously, they're designed to come out. Once you get into the nitty gritty, here's in front of the pilot, basically the foremost cylinder is from the air conditioning ventilating system. It's the moisture trap. Behind it, you've got the 2 bars for the rudder pedals hanging below. And you've got electrical junctions. Then behind it, you've got the front bulkhead, on the other side of which is the radar. The knob on top there is the undercarriage tracting lever, just to give you an idea of where the orientation. Normally, the instrument panel would be in the way there, but the instrument panels come out, so we're looking at what's basically behind the dashboard. Over on the other side, just in front of the observer's feet, you've just got a little corner here. This is just a bit of the wooden wall and a bit of the bulkhead. Show you this for 2 reasons. First of all, the little strip you can see coming down vertically turns out and turns up and goes off shot again. In a metal aircraft, you can earth all your electrical equipment to the structure of the aircraft. In a wooden aircraft, you can't, because it's wood. So you have to put in an earth bonding system all the way around the aircraft, made of this 1/4-inch copper strip that links every metal or electrical part of the aircraft to every other part. Mosquitoes had it, vampires had it, Sea Venoms had it too. You've got to take it all out, don't bend it, because if you bend it, it won't go back in the same place. So you take it out, treat it very, very carefully, hang it up on the wall, and then clean it off and put it back. Because if you get one place right, all the rest will be right as well. So it's very important to do that. The funny little round bits, the circles, are where you attach all the other kits to on the wooden inside of the aircraft. I've got a piece of the wood here actually. There's not very much. I mean, you can see that's the structure of a sea venom. There's not many of us here, so I'll trust you all. Take a look and pass around, as long as I get it back at the end of the evening. I don't do that when we have an audience of 100, but there we go. The little circles are how you do the attachments. Okay, here is your piece of wood. Here is your piece of plywood balsa wood composite. There we go, which is what you're looking at and handing around now. Okay, to make an attachment into that, you drill a little hole, 3/4 of an inch hole, and into it you insert an aluminium ferrule, which is a little barrel, a little cylinder of aluminium drilled in the middle to take a 2BA bolt. I hope you're not all totally metric, that you don't know what a 2BA is, but it's I don't know, it's about 3 mil, something like 4 mil, something like that. Okay, and you drill that in. Then you put on your little plywood disc that we saw in the picture. It's known as a biscuit in the trade, and you tack that onto the plywood surface with about 6 panel pins, so as it sticks there and it holds the ferrule against the wood. And then into that you screw whatever it is that you're going to bolt on with a steel bolt. Now, it's easy for me to say because I'm a chemist, but I'm sure you're relatively familiar with the idea that if you have a steel bolt going into an aluminium ferrule like that, and you surround it with wet balsa wood for 60 years, something's going to happen. And something does happen, and that's what happens. They basically, very, very slowly, they explode, the aluminium and the steel. They bond together with bimetallic corrosion. They weld themselves together. You'll never get the bolt out. The aluminium starts to corrode and starts to expand because it's the more reactive of the two. And the only thing you can do at that point is knock the whole thing out and start all over again, which we did about 80 or 90 times over with every single ferrule in the cockpit. I had a colleague at that stage who had a model engineering workshop in his garage, and he undertook to make the ferrules, and it drove him absolutely potty. He used to come in on a Saturday and say, "I've got another dozen for you, Alistair." I said, "Great, can you do us another 25? No. But we did eventually. We got them all together. And it's a long old tale of taking things apart, putting them on the bench, polishing them up, cleaning them up. But there's the complete cockpit once we're all finished and once we're all settled. I'm looking over the pilot's left shoulder, basically. On the far side, that's the top panel is for the pilot too. Underneath would go the radar for the radar observer. So that's basically your cockpit. Now we get to the fun bit, which is the fuselage pod. This really was a disgrace. That's the side on the observer. That's to the observer's right side. And that's what we found when we took off the outer plywood. You can see from that sample, it's plywood, balsa plywood, and then the red surface on the outside is a sheet of doped linen fabric with cellulose dope. Okay, the cellulose dope had long gone. That had all been ripped off. The plywood on the outside was easy. That just came off in a sheet, like very old wallpaper with lots of paint on it. The inner balsa wood largely was very rotted, and that just left us with the plywood on the inside, which by and large wasn't too bad, except for this one large panel, which was just hopeless. So we had to, before you can do any repairs to that, you have to prop it out on the inside. You've got a wooden circle, a wooden cylinder at this point, which you have to put pit props on the inside to give you something to push against to go in to replace all that wood. That's just another one of the ferrules. But you can see the innermost balsa wood there, which is the innermost plywood rather, sorry, in there, which is relatively sound, and that's what we were working to. So for that big panel, we had to go back and we had to replace with a brand new sheet of plywood, drilled to accept all those ferrules. It is a matter of last resort because the name of the game again is you want to preserve as much originality as you possibly can in the aircraft. I mean, if you're gonna destroy all the wood, rip it all out, start all of it over again, you're not restoring the airplane. You're building a replica to some degree. You're recreating something that wasn't the original airplane. So you keep it as original as you possibly can. But in the case of the plywood on the inside, in the case of the balsa wood, which was totally rotten and would have gone on to do great damage to the aircraft, that had to be changed as well. The outer plywood had to be changed and replaced, and the final linen had to be. We couldn't avoid that. We had to do that to reconstruct the fuselage pod. Every other part of the aircraft is exactly as we took it off and restored it. So there's the wood going back in. You can see we're building up planks there with glue, and you work out from the innermost skin. You put the 2 layers of balsa wood in and skin it over in plywood. You end up with something looking like that, which you then sand down to make sure you've got a lovely, nice finish. 2 or 3 coats of cellulose dope onto the carpet. That cellulose dope is a wonderful smelly substance. It's a bit like an old-fashioned varnish. 2 or 3 coats of that just to make the wood less porous, and then 1 coat of dope on the top, and then you start putting the linen on. So you give it a coat of dope, you put a sheet of the best quality Irish linen on top of that, another coat of dope straight onto the top of that to get it all nice and messy. There is no other way to do this, but you just roll your sleeves up and go blah across it like that with your hands. You smooth it all off with your hands. There is no tool made that will do the job for you. You do it manually, and then you put more dope on it and more dope. You leave it, you come back the next day, it's all come up in blisters. You know, when you put new wallpaper on the wall, it all comes up in blisters. So you prick out the blisters, and with a special implement called a teaspoon, which is great. You just prick them out, and then you put a little bit of dope on, back of a teaspoon, and smooth it all out. Come back the next day, it's all blistered up in other places, so you do it all over again. And eventually, when you're on the verge of madness after about 3 or 4 days, you've got rid of all the blisters. You've got a nice, smooth, doped surface. Give it about 7 or 8 coats of the red dope, 2 coats of silver dope, because you need to protect against UV light. UV light will actually penetrate the outer layers of paintwork and damage the fabric if you don't do that. Silver dope protects it. Then it's camouflage time. Then it's top coat paint time. So again, as many coats as it will take, as it will need to give you a nice smooth surface like that. What you're trying to do is you're putting cellulose dope over the linen, which of course is itself vegetable derived and cellulose derived, making a composite, and you're filling in the warp and the weft of the fabric with dope to get a nice, smooth, shiny surface. You do it by spray, you do it by spray gun, and you basically just have to keep going over it and going over it and going over it. White coat one day, grey coat the next day. I picked a nice warm day to do that work in April about 5 years ago. Best day's work I've ever done in the museum. I was as high as a kite by the time I got home on the cellulose fumes. I highly recommend it. It's great fun. And then you really are. You've turned the corner. You've started to restore now. You've started to rebuild. The fiberglass radome nose is quite easy. I mean, that was in relatively good condition, so that just needed a bit of crack filling, a bit of black paint. The canopy was less so. The canopy, having been exposed to the elements and being made of magnesium aluminium alloy, was quite corroded. All the corrosion had to be drilled out and refilled before the thing was reassembled. The back end, there we go. All those bits have been put back on. Everything you see there, all the pipework was taken off, refurbished on the bench, put back, because we knew where to put it back, because we'd taken all the photographs and labelled it all to put it back. So that's basically most of our fuselage pod done. The canopy was another thing I'm afraid we had to scrap. It's a Perspex canopy. The 3 front panels are glass, armoured glass, which were fine. The Perspex canopy on the top, Perspex reacts with ultraviolet light. It's got an inhibitor chemical inside the forming of the Perspex, which prevents it from going milky like that. But once the inhibitor is used up, the canopy will just go because the Perspex reacts with the UV light. So that's why a Perspex canopy on an aircraft will stay absolutely pristine and clear for many, many years. Then suddenly, in the space of 2 years, it will go. There's nothing you can do. You have to take it out, junk it. And we had a new one made because we're just up the road from Elstree Studios, and surrounding Elstree Film Studios are lots of small companies, company industries that do things like that, because they make canopies for Spitfires and for X-Wings fighters for Star Wars and things like that. So we had a guy, we were able to give him the old ones as a mould, and from that he built the new ones. And it really does transform the look of the aircraft. Back to that smelly old engine. Here it is, as it came out, the Havilland Ghost 105, weighs about a ton. Can't remember what the thrust is now of it, but it's 10 combustion chambers around the centrifugal compressor with a single stage turbine at the back. A lot of pipe work around it, which you've all got to take off before anything else happens. We've touched briefly on rule 3, which is you never bend a pipe when you take it off, because if you do, you won't get it back on where it goes. Basically, if you keep it pristine and unbent, then if you get one end on, the other end will fit, and it'll be absolutely fine. While I was doing all of this, I was in the same hangar as the guys who were restoring the de Havilland Mosquito prototype, the very first Mosquito ever built. They had a very young lad with them, very keen, very enthusiastic young trainee who was sort of just out of school or whatever. And they gave him the job of going down the back and taking out all the hydraulic pipe work, which he did. And he said to the supervisor after he'd done it, he said, "I've done it all, Bob. I've taken all that pipe work out. I thought it would help you if I straightened it all out. No, don't do that. And I don't know if they ever put it back actually. Don't bend it and it will go back perfectly. That's as far as we stripped down the engine. I couldn't get the compressor off. I couldn't get the compressor wheel out. I couldn't get the turbine out. The whole thing had just got to that point and corroded itself solid. Having been outdoors for so long, the thing had filled with water underneath. Unfortunately, it had cracked the compressor casing underneath. The bearings were still good. The thing would still rotate. So all we did was we took it off. We drilled out all the corrosion and we gave it a good old clean to get it all nice and shiny again. So there we are. That's it, nice and shiny. We did wonder if we'd ever get it to run again as an experiment, but because that compressor casing was cracked, we knew it was never actually going to happen. So we're slightly into final finishing now. Now, something that two things that people say to you when you're standing there restoring an aircraft in the public gaze and people come round. The first thing they always say to you, oh, it must be a labour of love, that. If anyone else says that to me, I shall kill them. I really will. And the other thing they always say is, oh, it must be a bit like a big airfix kit. Well, it is, actually. It is like a very big airfix kit with three differences. First of all, you've got to take it to pieces before you put it together again. Secondly, there are no instructions. And thirdly, you don't get a decor sheet with it for the markings. So anything you do for markings and everything, you've got to paint it on and you've got to mask it. You've got to spend, to write 438 on the side, you've got to spend a whole day with little bits of masking tape going round, and it takes you a day to mask it. It takes you 20 minutes to paint it, and then 2 minutes to rip it all back off again. But you have to do it in order to get the markings. Every marking, every stencil marking, every national marking, everything else, all has to be painted on by hand. No other way to do it. It's actually quite good fun. I quite enjoyed that bit. Got to that stage. This is it on the 1st of August 2017 when it celebrated its 60th anniversary of its first flight. And it was in a state at that time of restoration where I felt we could make a little bit of a splash in the museum and make a bit of a scene for it and everything else. So I spent £3.50 of my own money, I will have you know, down at Clinton Cards on happy birthday trash and balloons and stuff like that. I already had the signalling flags at home. I can't remember what it says now, Sea Venom or something. And just to commemorate the fact that it was 60 years since it first flew, and once again, somebody's looking after the old girl, which I think is rather nice. So, really, pod-wise, which is the biggest part of the whole enterprise, really, that's where we're at. We've got the fuselage pod finished in about 2018, and then started moving into other various bits of the restoration, which are a little bit more straightforward on the whole. So before we move on for that, we'll just go to the little nerdy bit, because it's being restored in the colours of 891 Naval Squadron. So why did we pick 891 Naval Air Squadron to restore it back into? Well, the records show that it served with about 3 squadrons, 891, 893 and 894, went to sea with all 3 of them probably, but it served its longest time with 891 Squadron. It served the shortest time with 894 Squadron, which is how the museum painted it up when they got it from HMS Dryad. The reason probably they did it, because 894 had very impressive shark's mouth markings and so forth on their sea venoms and eyes and everything else, and it probably just looked nice wrong. And because it's Rule 4, when you're restoring an aeroplane, any restoration project of a historic aircraft, always try and get it back to a state for which you know and you have evidence of how that aircraft looked in real life. Because otherwise, you really are just doing a glorified airfix kit. And so that's why we're restoring XG730 to a condition, to a visual appearance that we know for almost certain that it looked like at one stage in its history. That to us as restorers is really quite important. It was quite an active. It wasn't one of the most glorious historic squadrons, but it flew during the war. It flew Sea Hurricanes off catapults in the Atlantic in the war. Flew North Africa. It flew Hellcats, which is an American lease-lend fighter, and everything else. It flew Sea Venoms, and it disbanded in 1960. It was the last squadron to fly. I think it was the last squadron to fly the Sea Venoms. It was the last squadron flying the straight wing fighters, because every other fighter squadron in the Navy by that stage was flying something like Sea Vixens or Scimitars, or later on Phantoms or anything. So they were the last squadron in the Navy to fly Sea Venoms. They've never reformed. Actually, they've never reformed since they broke up in 1960. That's the squadron badge, which you'll see has got the logo in the red and gold logo, which, as I'm sure the older people in the audience will know, probably some of the others, is the emblem, the logo of the Kon-Tiki expedition, which was an expedition in the late 40s by a Norwegian anthropologist and explorer called Thor Heyerdahl. And he had a theory that the Polynesian islands in the South Atlantic were South Pacific rather, were colonized by South American Indians from Peru and Ecuador, who sailed across the Pacific on rafts that they made out of balsa wood. And to prove his theory, he, with a few colleagues, fellow adventurers, he went to Peru and Ecuador, cut down, made himself a balsa wood raft, and they sailed it across the South Pacific until they reached Polynesia, thus proving that the whole thing could have been done. They named the raft and they named the whole project after the Polynesian sun god, Kon-Tiki, and that was the Polynesian emblem for the Kon-Tiki sun god. This was in about the late 1940s. What's it got to do with the Sea Venom? Well, when 891 Squadron formed in 54, the new commanding officer of the squadron was looking around for a new squadron emblem, new squadron logo. And he had this idea. He wrote to Thor Heyerdahl and he said, because your raft was made of balsa wood and our aeroplanes are made of balsa wood, could we use your Kon-Tiki mast logo as our squadron emblem? And Thor Heyerdahl wrote back and said yes. And so that is why 891 Squadron always flew with the Kon-Tiki mask on their aeroplanes. I wish they'd had something else, because it was a right horror to paint. It took about a fortnight to actually mask that, but it's worth it because it looks just great on the tail of the aircraft. So that's the squadron provenance, and basically that's the aircraft as we now have it today. The De Havilland Museum in 2019-2020 built and opened a brand new hangar. The aircraft is in that hangar at the moment, such as we have. We've not just got the pod, we've got the tail section, we've got the tail booms and the tail fins, tail surfaces and so forth. They are basically just a matter of cleaning and restoring metal, or I won't go into that here. They took a couple of years to do. It's just getting metal polish back down to a decent surface and go through the repainting process and so forth. The wings are the last bit left. The wings are in a different hangar being worked on. There's no room in the new hangar to do that. We're in a different hangar. The problem about doing any presentation like this is unless you take all your photographs yesterday, it's all out of date. So the wings have now had a lot more work done on them. That's just the inner wings, because of course with folding wings, each wing is in two halves. So this is just the inner wing that attaches here to the aircraft, and the wing fold line is out the far end. This wing facing us here has now been completely repainted. I've done that over the summer. It's now in its full white camouflage colour. The other wing we're just starting to work on now. You may recall from the early pictures that the Sea Venom had two great big fuel tanks on the wingtips. These are that's one of them. They're 9 feet long, they're aluminium fuel tanks, and those two have had to be completely and utterly stripped down to bare metal, reprimed, repainted, and everything else. It's the only way to restore it, to be sure that the thing is going to last for a good few decades to come. You do it once, you do it properly, and that's it. So really that's where we are on the restoration as a whole. But as I said at the beginning, you work on a thing like this for 16 years, you get to find out a lot of fun facts and a lot of silly facts and stuff like that. You've got to get to meet a lot of interesting people as well. So before I go, I'm just going to share with you a few stupid things, a few vagaries. We're going to start with the cockpit. You can see that it's a two-man cockpit. It's very cramped inside the cockpit. Two of you side by side. As a result, one of the checks you have to do pre-flight when you're getting in and getting settled in, you have to make sure you haven't strapped yourself in with your next door neighbour's seat straps. You are working as a closely knit team, but there are times if you have to eject out, it's every man for himself. You do not want to be tied to him when you go out. Okay, so you make sure you're using only your seat straps. Now, pilot's notes. When you buy a Sea Venom, if you do, to operate it. You get for the operating maintenance, for the maintenance and so forth, you get about 5 or 6 of those. Basically, it's called an air publication, an AP. This one's a little bit dog-eared, but it was like that when I got it. But there's several of those, and that's the maintenance instructions. That's how you take it to pieces, service it, maintain it, reassemble it. If you're going to fly it, you just get that. Okay, it's not much. I mean, pilots, you don't need to know how it works. They fly the damn thing. So you get the pilot's notes, which are full of interesting facts and helpful guidance on how to fly your Sea Venom. For example, it's believed that the ditching qualities of this aircraft are poor. So recommended that the aircraft is abandoned rather than ditched, okay, which means it may say Royal Navy on the side of it, but don't assume that it floats, because it's not going to if it comes down in the water. So get out of it first, okay? Back in the cockpit, here's the cockpit. One of the first things I did when I got my Sea Venom to work on, I sat down in the pilot's seat and I sort of checked it out, right? You know, column, throttles, levers, whatever, big 6 instruments and so forth. Couldn't find the lever to fold the wings. That's funny. Where I found it, if I'm sitting in the ejection seat, it's round there. It's right round behind you. I thought, well, that's an odd place to put it. I met a Sea Venom pilot not long afterwards, and I said to them, why on earth did they put it round there? And he said, well, you think the last lever in the cockpit you want to pull by accident. Very career limiting to fold the wings mid-flight. Don't do it. Doesn't explain why on the Sea Vixen, which came afterwards, they put it right there where you'd find the handbrake on the car. So, you know, the pilot can do it anytime else. But there we go. That's why it's over there, because you don't want to mess with it, basically. On that subject of getting out, simultaneous ejection should be avoided if possible, as the observer's seat is angled 1.5 degrees towards the pilot's seat. There is a slight risk of collision. If you both go out together, you're going to meet up 50 feet above the aircraft. So off you go, but please get on with it, because I want to get out too. Okay, so all little oddities you find. Now, a little memory test for you. We go back to de Havilland at Sea, which is how we started the whole rigmarole. There is the first jet aircraft landing on the carrier. The aircraft is a Vampire. The carrier was HMS Ocean. Well done. Thank you very much. The year was 1945. Yeah. The pilot was Winkle Brown. And here is Winkle Brown, because we had the Sea Venom formed the centerpiece of a little de Havilland at Sea exhibition, which we put up to talk about the work that de Havilland did with the Royal Navy. And we were delighted in 2014 that Winkle Brown himself was able to come up and open that exhibition for us, which he did with his better half, Jean. It was amazing. He was 93 years old at the time, I think. He drove all the way round from his home in Sussex, down the M25 on the hottest Saturday of the year. He spent 2 hours signing books and autographs and photographs and everything like that for the 300 odd people that attended to see him. Then he stood up and unveiled a plaque and gave a little impromptu speech for 20 odd minutes. It was just great. He was getting a little bit shaky by the time he was finished, and so we'd booked a table to take him to lunch at the local pub, and we got him in there. And Jean said to him when we got in, said, "Right, Eric, listen to me. For God's sake, just shut up, sit down, and eat something, will you? Because you're tired." So we got half a glass of wine to him, and he was off again. Did they ever tell you when I was doing this? I could have sat there and listened to him for ages, and we did. He was the most amazing raconteur, not an ounce of arrogance or self-importance about the bloke, just pure gold. It was a privilege to sit with him and listen to him, and sit at his feet and just listen to all his stories for all that time. Here's another guy who I met a couple of years ago now. Periodically, when I've been working on the restoration, there's been a very nice gentleman come down from St Albans who pottered round, whose name is Roger Young. He's a gentleman in his 80s, and he used to be an observer in the Fleet Air Arm in the 1960s, and he not only flew in the Sea Venom squadron, he actually flew in that Sea Venom. He has it in his logbook, and he was kind enough to photocopy. He came down once and he photocopied a page of his logbook to show me, and gave me the photocopy and said, "Here you are." This proves that I have an association with this particular aircraft, and that's great. And he's popped down. Haven't seen him for a couple of years now. We've been a regular visitor. This is not Roger Young. This is another gentleman. This man's name is Rob Faulkner. And back in the lockdown, 2020, when we couldn't welcome people to the museum, we used to do a webinar every 2-3 weeks on a specific aircraft. We used to pick an aircraft and do an evening presentation for which people would phone in or log on and book tickets and so forth. I was on the day we were doing the Sea Venom, I was in the museum shop, phone rang, and it's this gentleman. Hello, my name's Rob Faulkner. I would like to get a ticket booked on for tonight for the webinar, please, on the Sea Venom. No problem, I sorted that out for him. He said, I have a particular interest because I'm an ex-pilot from the Fleet Air Arm in the 1960s, and I believe I was the last pilot ever to fly your aircraft, XG730, from the deck of an aircraft carrier, which was HMS Hermes in 1960 with 893 Squadron. And I said, well, in that case, Mr. Faulkner, you don't have to worry about paying for tonight's seminar. You are tonight's seminar, okay? Anything else? And I said, just as a long shot, Rob, you don't happen to know a bloke called Roger Young, do you? And he said, of course I know Roger Young. He said, he was my observer in 893 Squadron. I knew. I flew your Sea Venom with him, I think. Sadly, it was lockdown, of course, at the time. But that afternoon, we convened a little Zoom meeting. We were able nights, the pilot and the observer of the Sea Venom online. They hadn't seen each other for 60 years, but they were able to meet and greet at least online. I'm hoping that both of them are alive and well enough that one day we will be able to actually. Rob lives in Derbyshire. He's not very mobile these days, but his son can bring him down. I'm really hoping that we can reunite the pair of them in person in front of the aircraft that both of them flew. How good would that be? And that's one of the little bonuses, one of the little benefits you get when you stick your head above the parapet and you say, I'd like to restore a Sea Venom, please. You never know quite where it will lead you. It led me to a change of job. I was an engineer in the mainly transport business for many, many years, even while I was volunteering here. And it led to me changing career and becoming the curator of the Havilland Aircraft Museum for about 3 years, which is a job I absolutely loved. And had it not been for COVID and various other factors, I possibly would still be doing it to this day. But there we go. But you get to meet fascinating people, see fascinating things. You get to turn something like that into something like that. The job is still going. I think we've still got another 2 or 3 years to come. I've no idea what I'll do after that. I'd just walk, I don't know. Haven't got that far. But it's been a great journey so far. And one of the fun things I've found is that restoring the airplane is only half the fun. The other half of the fun is telling people about it, because you're doing it in a working museum and people are forever coming up and saying, oh, what are you doing there then? Tell me about what you're doing. And you tell them about what you're doing. That must be a labour of love. Shut up. Yes, and that thing. But that sort of thing. It's great to talk to the people and share it with people. And it's great to out and share it with people like yourselves as well. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Come down and see the real thing. Meet the old girl for real down at the museum. But thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you so much.